Hey guys, tonight we drift into one of the strangest tailies that ever floated out of the silent halls of the Soviet space program. So settle in, dim the lights, let your breathing slow down, because this story moves softly through the weightless chambers of an old orbiting station where a handful of exhausted men claimed they saw something that should not exist at all. Or maybe it existed too much. Too bright, too large, too peaceful for a world built on suspicion and steel. We are sliding back into the year 1984, a year wrapped so tightly in its own fear that even daylight felt political. The Soviet Union was still trying to hold itself together with strict smiles and perfectly ironed uniforms. Every face needed to look calm even if no one actually was. And somewhere high above that uneasy world, two cosmonauts drifted inside a slightly creaking metal tube called Salyut-7. Its panels hummed with the steady rhythm of old machinery, and its walls carried the gentle scent of metal and dust that had been warmed and cooled 1,000 times. Vladimir Genabikov had already been up here for what felt like ages. He moved slowly now, not because he was tired, but because space had taught him to waste no energy at all. Viktor Sevenik floated beside him like a quiet shadow, trying to fix one system after another, because half the station had a habit of switching itself off for no reason. You would think the Soviet engineers had built it with care. They did. But even good machines get moody after too many months in low Earth orbit. The two men spoke softly as if the station itself needed rest. They worked. They ate. They tried to sleep. They stared out the small round window whenever they wanted to remember that Earth still existed. Blue, soft, alive, far away. And then there was the endless silence. Not the comforting kind. The kind that sits in your chest and tells you that no one can hear you if you scream. Which of course they never did. They were trained. They were calm. They were supposed to be the pride of the motherland. But then came the day that changed everything. A day that would be buried, forgotten, whispered about only in hallways that smelled of old paper and stricter secrets. The men had been drifting in their routine for so long that they barely noticed the passing of time. Every hour looked like the next. Every meal tasted the same. Every thought moved through the same familiar loop. That might be why the first moment of strangeness slipped into their minds like a dream that refused to announce itself. It began with a glow. A soft orange light that shimmered through the small cracks of the equipment panels. At first they thought something had overheated. Maybe a wire had burned. Maybe the power grid had decided to collapse at the worst moment again. Vladimir pushed forward to check the monitors. Viktor floated behind him, trying to steady himself against a handrail that wobbled more than it should have. But the glow did not fade. It brightened. It warmed. It felt impossibly alive. They both turned toward the window with the slow floating motion of men who no longer remembered what gravity felt like. Outside the curve of Earth drifted under them like a silent blue lantern, and then the shape moved into view. A shape so bright that it softened their vision, as if light itself had taken a breath. At first they did not trust their eyes. They blinked. They squinted. They waited for some rational explanation to float into their minds. They were Soviet cosmonauts after all. Rational thinking was practically a requirement for breathing. But the shape continued to glow, soft, golden, gentle, and then it unfolded, wide, spreading, like wings that stretched out far beyond anything that should exist outside the station. The figure grew taller, taller still, until it reached a size that made the entire station feel small, fragile, breakable with a single touch, yet there was no threat in the presence. Only a quiet calm that felt strangely familiar. Vladimir felt his chest loosen. Viktor let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. The figure drifted beside them. And then another appeared. And another. Until there were 7 of them, moving in slow, graceful waves as if gravity had never been invented. Their faces glowed with soft light. Their features held a distant human shape but stretched, smoothed, perfected in a way no sculptor could ever carve. Their wings moved slowly as if the vacuum of space had turned into gentle water around them. Viktor whispered something under his breath. A soft, shaky sound that the audio recorder later captured even though it was never meant to. He said, "They are smiling at us." And then he fell silent. The figures stayed there, floating, watching, not speaking, not moving toward the station. Just drifting like ancient guardians who had taken a moment to glance at 2 tired humans in a rattling metal shell. It lasted 10 minutes. 10 long quiet minutes that felt like a dream stretched wide and thin. And then without a sound, the figures pulled back. They faded. They softened. They dissolved into the empty blue shadow of the earth below. And then they were gone. The two men stared after them for a long time. Then they floated back into the station without speaking. Because honestly, what words could hold something like that? They returned to their tasks. They ate. They pretended to sleep. And they waited for morning, even though morning in space is just another turn of the Earth. When they finally reported it to Mission Control, the line went silent. The analysts blamed exhaustion, isolation, space-induced hallucinations. All the usual labels. Except for one problem. Later crews reported the same vision, the same number, the same glow, the same gentle wings. And those reports were sealed away so tightly that they did not see daylight until 2024. By then the world had changed. But the mystery had not. We drift back into the quiet hum of Salyut-7, where the air tasted faintly of metal and recycled breath. Vladimir and Victor floated in the dim corridor with the soft glow of instrument panels brushing their faces. Neither man wanted to speak. Not because they were afraid, but because the silence felt heavier now. As if the station itself had absorbed the presence of those glowing visitors, and was still trying to decide what to do with the memory. Vladimir kept rubbing his eyes with slow, tired motions. He told himself that nothing had happened. He told himself that the glow had been a trick of the sun. He even tried to blame low blood sugar because that was the kind of excuse Mission Control liked, but deep down he knew none of that made sense. Victor knew it too. He stared at a floating pouch of food without opening it. He watched it drift away as if he had forgotten what food even was. His thoughts kept looping back to that soft light and the calm faces that looked too kind for a universe that usually hit humans with rocks and radiation. The station creaked gently as it moved through another piece of shadow. Panels expanded. Metal shifted. Somewhere behind the wall, a small fan buzzed with an uneven rhythm. Normally, those sounds were comforting, familiar. Tonight they felt like someone whispering in another room. The two men drifted through the narrow hallway without speaking. Every movement was slow and careful, as if they were afraid to disturb something invisible lingering in the air. At one point, Victor floated close to the window again. He placed his hand on the frame and stared out into the soft blue curve of Earth. Nothing unusual drifted past. No glow, no wings, no faces. Just the empty dark that stretched forever. He sighed. He felt small. Not the usual small that every cosmonaut gets used to. This was a different kind, a gentle kind. The kind that makes a man think there are things out there that watch without judgment. When they finally made their official report, the room on the other end went silent for far too long. Then came the calm voice of a psychologist who had probably never set foot in a rocket. He asked the usual questions. Had they eaten enough? Had they slept enough? Were they feeling pressure behind the eyes? Did they sense cabin tension? Vladimir answered with the trained smoothness of a man who had spent years pretending everything was normal, even when it was not. Victor barely spoke at all. He just kept staring at the window as if something might drift back into view if he waited long enough. Mission Control told them to rest. As if rest ever came easily up here, the lights dimmed. The fans hummed. And the two men strapped themselves into their small sleeping chambers. The fabric cradled their bodies without real comfort. Vladimir closed his eyes and tried to imagine the soft glow fading from his memory. Victor kept his eyes open for a long time. When he finally let them close, he half expected to dream of wings brushing against the window. Morning in space feels the same as night. The only difference is the slightly warmer tone of the panels when sunlight slips through a seam. The men woke slowly. Their movements felt heavier even though they were weightless. Vladimir started repairing a coolant pump because it was something familiar. Victor drifted beside him, running soft checks on the oxygen system. Neither spoke about last night. They did not need to. The quiet had its own language. Hours passed, then days. Their tasks became slow dances through the narrow halls. Every cable became a familiar friend. Every panel had a mood. Every hum had a personality. And somewhere in all that quiet, the memory of the glowing figures began blending into the rhythm of daily orbit, not fading, just settling. Like dust that refuses to leave a sunbeam. Mission Control continued to check their mental state. They kept suggesting that isolation might have played tricks on their minds. They even mentioned space-induced sensory distortion, which was a fancy way of saying you probably saw nothing at all. But the two men did not argue. Arguing took energy. Instead, they just proceeded with their tasks. They smiled at the right moments. They kept the station alive. And they held their secrets quietly like small fragile objects that belonged to no one else. Then came the whisper from ground control that another crew was preparing to join Salyut-7. Reinforcements. New eyes. Fresh minds. The idea should have brought comfort. Instead, it brought an odd mix of relief and unease. Vladimir wondered if the newcomers would sense something strange lingering in the station. Victor wondered if the glowing figures would come back. Both wondered if they would ever be believed even with witnesses. When the second crew finally arrived, the docking shook the station with a tired metallic thud. Fresh voices drifted through the hallway. Laughter. Light teasing. The kind of noise that men make when they still trust the world. The newcomers floated into the station with wide eyes and bright energy. They brought new supplies, including a small packet of treats that smelled faintly of chocolate. Victor almost smiled. For a while, life felt normal again. Panels were fixed. Experiments were completed. The station felt busy. The newcomers asked questions about the systems, about daily routines, about the best place to nap without drifting into a wall. They noticed that Vladimir and Victor spoke less than expected. They noticed the tired shadows under their eyes. But they were polite enough not to pry. Then it happened again. It began on a quiet evening when everyone floated through the hallway with slow, relaxed motions. A soft glow seeped through the edges of the window. One crew member nudged another. The glow spread. It sharpened. It unfolded just like before. One figure, then two, then 7. Each glowing with that same soft golden warmth that made the station feel like a tiny fragile shell drifting through something far kinder than the universe should be. The newcomers froze. One whispered a sound that might have been a prayer. Another whispered a word that the audio system barely caught. They are smiling. The same line Victor had said days earlier, the same tone, the same quiet breath. The figures drifted beside the station with the same slow movements. No rush. No threat, no sound, just presence. Pure and gentle. The crew watched in silent awe. Their hearts beat slowly. Their minds went still. It felt like a moment outside of time. A moment that no human language had ever been designed to describe, and then just like before, the figures pulled back. They softened into the shadow. They vanished into the blue curve of Earth, leaving the station drifting quietly through its orbit once again. The newcomers looked at Vladimir and Victor with wide, stunned eyes. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every man in that room knew that nothing in any training manual could explain what had just drifted past. The days that followed moved through the station with a strange soft tension. Not fear exactly. More like the quiet hush that fills an old cathedral just before dawn. Every man aboard felt it, a gentle heaviness in the chest. A slow tilt of the thoughts toward that soft golden glow that had drifted outside the window. No one said a word about it because each man knew that once spoken aloud, the memory would lose its shape. Some truths stay clearer when they remain unspoken. Life inside Salyut-7 returned to its usual rhythm, but the rhythm felt slower and deeper now. The air tasted the same, yet the silence carried a new weight. The newcomers tried to pretend everything was normal. They floated through the corridors with practiced ease. They watched the instruments. They checked the wires. They argued lightly about the quality of the rehydrated soup, but now and then they would glance toward the window with a look that lingered just a little too long. Vladimir watched them with a steady, tired patience. He understood that look. It was the same look he had worn for days after the first sighting. A look that asked the same soft question again and again. What exactly had they seen? Victor drifted through the station like a quiet, drifting thought. He no longer tried to reason through it. He simply accepted the mystery with the calm resignation of a man who had already surrendered to something larger than logic. The second crew tried to speak with mission control about the vision. They tried to describe the light, the size, the gentle faces. But their words sounded thin even to their own ears. On the ground, the psychologists repeated the same explanations in the same patient tone. Stress, fatigue, group influence. Cosmic rays affecting the optic nerves. Space is strange. The mind is fragile. Nothing to worry about? Please continue your tasks with normal discipline. The simple fact that 6 men over 2 missions had described the exact same site did not seem to trouble the officials. Or maybe it troubled them too much, which was why they pretended it meant nothing at all. The crew adjusted to life together as best they could. They shared quiet meals. They exchanged soft, dry jokes about the rations. One of the newcomers liked to drift upside down during conversations because he said it made the room feel bigger. Another kept humming old folk songs under his breath even though he claimed he did not like music. Small habits like these helped the station feel a little more human again. They reminded everyone that they were still just men in a tin shell circling a planet that never asked them to leave in the first place. Still, the glow lingered in their thoughts. At night, the men floated into their sleeping chambers with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. They closed their eyes slowly, as if opening them might reveal another pair of golden wings outside the window. No one slept deeply. Dreams drifted in slow waves. Some dreams carried the shape of 7 tall figures with gentle faces. Others carried nothing at all, just weightless silence. Vladimir woke one cycle with a steady sense that something was different in the air. He drifted softly through the hallway, taking slow, measured breaths. The station felt too quiet. Even the hum of the machinery seemed to soften as if it were holding its breath. Victor soon joined him. His eyes carried the same question. Then the newcomers drifted in one by one, drawn by the hush that wrapped the station like soft cloth. No glow appeared. No wings. No faces. Yet every man sensed that something was near. Not a presence. More like an echo. A faint impression of something that had passed by recently and left a soft imprint on the space around it. The men floated silently for several minutes. Then the feeling faded like a ripple smoothing itself across still water. They looked at each other. No one spoke. They returned to their tasks with the slow, purposeful movements of monks in a floating monastery. During one experiment session, Victor noticed a small shift in the readings of the radiation sensors. The numbers moved in unfamiliar patterns. Not dangerous. Just unusual. He mentioned it to Vladimir in a low voice. Vladimir nodded with the calm expression of a man who had run out of surprises weeks ago. He checked the sensors himself and watched the gentle rise and fall like a heartbeat, just slightly out of rhythm. The newcomers gathered around the screen. They watched the numbers glide softly up, then softly down. Nothing sharp. Nothing alarming. Just a slow drifting pulse that did not match any known pattern. Mission Control dismissed it immediately. Faulty sensors. Natural variation. Electron noise. The usual labels again. But the crew knew better. They had lived inside the station long enough to understand its moods. They knew what normal looked like. This was not normal. This was something else. Something calm. Something soft. As if the space around them had been stirred by a passing presence and was now settling itself into place again. The second sighting had changed the newcomers more deeply than they admitted. Their faces carried a quiet reverence that felt too ancient for a metal station built by engineers who believed in numbers more than mysteries. One of them began writing notes in a small floating pad. Notes that he never explained. Notes that he tucked away every time anyone drifted too close. Another spent more time near the window than near the equipment. He listened to the silence outside, as if waiting for something to sing back. Vladimir watched all this with a steady, thoughtful gaze. He wondered how they would live once they returned to Earth. Whether they would ever tell anyone the truth. Whether anyone would believe them. Victor had already decided he would never speak of it outside official reports. The memory felt too fragile, too sacred, too strange for casual conversation. The daily routine continued, cycle after cycle. The Earth turned beneath them like a patient blue lantern. Night and day swept across the station in quiet rhythm. The crew drifted through each shift with a sense of slow acceptance. They were caretakers of a secret that no one wanted to believe. A gentle burden floated on their shoulders like soft golden dust. Then one cycle the station lights flickered with a faint pulse. Not a malfunction, something else. The men looked at each other with slow, widening eyes. The pulse came again, soft, rhythmic, almost like a response. Vladimir floated toward the main panel and placed his hand upon it. The panel felt faintly warm. That was when the soft glow seeped into the window again. Night faded into a pale, dull light as the third day began. The valley stirred with slow, tired movements, as if the entire landscape had aged 100 years in a single sunrise. People rose from the ground with heavy limbs. Many felt weaker than the day before. Their steps dragged across the broken earth. Their eyes burned with a strange sting that water could not soothe. The air carried a faint bitter taste that lingered on the tongue no matter how much someone tried to wash it away. It felt as if the air itself had been wounded. Let us drift toward the river where the banks had grown darker. The soil turned soft under the feet of the survivors. They did not know why the earth seemed to hold the warmth of the blast even after days had passed. Some scooped water for drinking, though the surface shimmered with a thin, oily film. People told themselves it was only ash. They had to believe it was safe. Thirst overshadowed fear. A child drank deeply, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Moments later, he felt a strange heat spread through his chest. He sat down and held his stomach. His mother looked at him with tired eyes. She wanted to comfort him, but she could barely stand. Across the valley, rescue workers continued to gather bodies. The workers moved slowly. Their legs trembled under their own weight. They had arrived only a day earlier, yet the same strange weakness had touched them as well. One worker lifted a body and saw that strands of hair clung to his gloves. The slightest pressure caused the hair to slip free. He stared in disbelief. He felt a shiver race through him, though the morning air was warm. He wiped his face with his sleeve and noticed small red marks forming along his wrist. Let us float toward the remains of the school building where a group of survivors gathered. The walls leaned in strange angles. The roof had collapsed. Only part of the entrance arch remained. A teacher who survived led several children out into the open to give them fresh air. The children walked slowly. Some clutched their stomachs. Others held their heads. A boy began to bleed from his nose without warning. The teacher tried to stop the blood with cloth torn from his shirt. The cloth darkened quickly. The teacher felt fear rising in his chest, but he forced his voice to remain calm for the children's sake. Near the marketplace, soldiers cleared debris from the roads. They used long poles to shift the remains of wooden carts and collapsed beams. One soldier grabbed a broken gate and stepped back with surprise. The wood felt unusually warm. He placed his hand near it again and felt heat radiating from within, as if the material still remembered the blast. He looked at his partner, who shrugged with tired confusion. They continued their work. They did not understand why their fingers tingled after touching ordinary objects. Let us move toward a small house at the edge of the blast zone. Its roof was gone, but its walls still stood. Inside, an elderly woman sat with her back against a beam. She breathed slowly. Her skin had turned a pale, waxy color. A doctor kneeled beside her. He tried to give her water, but she shook her head. She whispered that she felt cold, even though her forehead burned with fever. The doctor touched her arm gently. Her skin peeled away under his fingertips. He pulled his hand back in horror, but forced himself to stay beside her. Her breathing slowed with each passing moment until it finally stopped. Outside the house, a group of men gathered around a small fire. They whispered softly. They spoke of strange dreams and restless nights. They spoke of a sensation that felt like insects crawling beneath their skin. One man scratched his arm until it bled. Another man said he felt as if something heavy sat on his chest. None of them knew the word for what was happening. They only felt that something unseen was moving through their bodies. Let us drift toward the temple courtyard where more survivors had gathered. The monk who rang the cracked bell continued to offer prayers. His voice trembled slightly. He did not understand the sickness any more than the others. He only knew that people who looked fine in the morning could weaken by evening. A woman approached him holding her son. The child's eyes were swollen. His breath came in shallow gasps. The woman knelt and asked for help. The monk placed a hand on the boy's forehead. The heat pulsed through the skin like a burning coal. The monk whispered a prayer, though he felt a quiet helplessness settle in his chest. At the temporary aid station, doctors tried to record symptoms. They took notes in small journals now covered with ash. They described vomiting, lethargy, gum bleeding, hair loss, skin shedding without touch. The doctors looked at one another with confusion. Diseases they knew did not behave this way. Injuries they understood did not appear without wounds. Something invisible was attacking the survivors from within. They did not understand its nature. They only understood its effect. Let us float toward a stretch of flattened ground near the heart of the blast site. Soldiers marked the area with small wooden stakes. They measured distances from the center. They sketched circles in their notebooks. One officer stood silently staring at the charred earth. He whispered that the force must have been like the sun brought down to the surface. He wondered aloud how anyone survived at all. His voice trembled. He wiped his brow. His hand came away with strands of hair. He stared at it with growing fear. As the sun reached its peak, the temperature rose. The heat pressed down on the valley. People moved toward the few remaining patches of shade. They carried blankets, water jars, bundles of burnt belongings. Some lay on the ground and closed their eyes, hoping to sleep through the pain. Others sat upright, staring into the distance with empty expressions. Their minds drifted. Their bodies weakened. Time moved slowly. Each minute stretched into an hour. By late afternoon, the first signs of deep exhaustion began to spread across the survivors. A young man who had been helping carry water suddenly collapsed. His friends rushed to him. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. His lips turned pale. His eyes rolled upward. They tried to lift him, but he felt heavier than before. They called for a doctor. But the doctor who arrived looked nearly as weak as the patient. The doctor examined the young man, then lowered his head. He said the same phrase he had repeated all day. There was nothing he could do. Let us glide toward the horizon, where faint lines of smoke still rose. The sky held a dusty gray tone that dimmed the sunlight. The world looked washed out, flat, silent. Even the birds seemed reluctant to return to the valley. The few that circled above drifted away quickly, as if sensing danger that humans could not. Evening approached slowly. The survivors prepared for another night. Fires were lit using scraps of wood. People wrapped themselves in blankets, though the air remained warm. They whispered to one another. They asked why their families were falling ill. They asked when help would arrive. They asked why the world felt different now. The answers did not come. As darkness settled over the ruined land, an uneasy quiet filled the valley. The sound of wind carried through broken beams and shattered walls. The fires flickered. Shadows stretched across the ground. The survivors lay down again, hoping for rest, though sleep came rarely. The night grew colder. The sickness grew stronger. And the unseen force continued its silent, steady reach through every body it touched. This was only the beginning of the long, slow aftermath that would unfold through the days ahead. Dawn crept over the shattered city with a faint, pale light that barely reached the ground. The sky looked washed out, as if the color itself had been burned away. Survivors stirred with slow, uneasy movements. Many could not rise at all. Those who managed to stand felt lightheaded and weak. Each breath came with effort. Their bodies seemed to resist even the faintest motion. The sickness had settled deeper than anyone understood. Let us drift toward the riverside, where a group of men attempted to collect water again. The river flowed quietly, yet something in its calm surface seemed unnatural. When a man dipped his hands into the water, he felt a sting along his wrists. He lifted his hands and saw faint patches of red forming. Another man filled a cup and held it to the light. A thin layer of ash floated on top. He shook his head slowly but drank anyway. He had no other choice. The taste felt metallic. A few minutes later, he bent forward and held his stomach as a wave of nausea washed over him. Nearby, a woman knelt beside a small girl whose hair had begun to fall out in soft, fragile clusters. The girl cried softly. She did not understand why her hair slipped between her fingers so easily. The woman gathered the loose strands into a cloth and tried to comfort her. But the woman herself felt her own strength fading. Her legs trembled beneath her. Her voice cracked. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, hoping the dizziness would pass. It did not. Let us move through a narrow street where rescue workers continued their grim task. Their faces looked drained. Their eyes dull. Each hour seemed to steal more of their strength. One worker leaned against a broken wall and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, his vision blurred at the edges. He touched his forehead and felt heat rising beneath the skin. He told himself it was exhaustion. He told himself it would pass. But deep down he felt a quiet fear that something else was at work. Across the ruins, a group of soldiers had set up a temporary command post. They spread maps across a damaged table and marked positions with pieces of charred wood. One soldier coughed repeatedly. Another held his side as he bent over. Their commanding officer tried to maintain order, but his voice grew softer with each sentence. He paused often to catch his breath. He felt sweat gather on his brow despite the cool morning air. When he wiped his head, he noticed hair sticking to his hand. He stared at it for a long moment, unable to understand what was happening to him. Let us float toward the temple courtyard again, where more survivors had gathered during the night. The monk stood near the entrance offering words of comfort, though his own body showed signs of strain. His head felt heavy, his knees weak. He looked at the growing number of people lying on the ground. Some moaned softly, others stared blankly at the sky. A young mother approached him carrying her infant. The baby's skin had turned pale and blotched. The monk placed a hand on the child. The heat radiating from the small chest felt alarming. The mother asked if her child would recover. The monk opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He simply bowed his head. Farther west, a doctor sat beside a line of patients. His hands shook as he tried to record symptoms. His journal pages had grown stiff from ash and moisture. He wrote about fevers that rose and fell without pattern. He wrote about bleeding that started without injury. He wrote about the weakening pulse of each patient. He lifted the arm of a young woman and checked her skin. It peeled away with the slightest touch. The doctor felt a sinking feeling in his chest. His mind searched for explanations, but none fit the pattern. He felt the truth forming in the back of his thoughts. Something invisible. Something powerful. Something that did not behave like any known illness. Let us drift toward the heart of the blast site where the ground still shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Soldiers avoided stepping directly on the scorched earth. They used long poles to move debris. One soldier pointed to a piece of metal fused to the remains of a stone wall. The metal looked partially melted. A second soldier touched it with his pole and felt warmth through the wood. He stepped back with a quiet gasp. The blast had passed days ago, yet the earth still held its heat like a lingering memory. As the day progressed, the sickness deepened. People who had shown mild symptoms the day before now struggled to stay conscious. A man carrying water collapsed mid-step. His friends rushed to him. His eyes rolled back, his breathing slowed. They tried to lift him, but his body felt limp and heavy. A doctor arrived and examined him. The doctor shook his head slowly. The man's pulse faded within minutes. Let us move toward a street where several children sat against a wall. Their faces were pale, their lips cracked. One child lifted a piece of bread and tried to eat. The bread tasted strange, ash flavored every bite. He forced himself to swallow, but the food rose again in his throat. He doubled over and gagged. His friend placed a hand on his back, though her own hand trembled. Near the edge of the valley, a group of families attempted to leave the city. They walked slowly. Many carried bundles on their backs. Some pushed makeshift carts. But after a short distance, several collapsed. Their legs refused to carry them farther. One man looked behind him at the ruined city and whispered that the land itself seemed to hold them in place. He felt as if every step forward drained more of his strength. Let us float over the remaining rooftops where ash collected in thick layers. Each gust of wind sent clouds of dust swirling into the air. The dust settled on faces and clothing. People brushed it away, but it returned within minutes. A woman looked at her arms and saw thin red patches forming again. She sighed softly. She no longer had the energy to worry. Throughout the afternoon, the number of fainting survivors increased. The aid stations filled with people lying on mats or directly on the ground. Doctors moved from one patient to the next, but their steps grew slower. Many doctors began to show the same symptoms as the injured: weakness, fever, hair falling, skin peeling. They worked despite their own condition, knowing they had no replacements. Let us drift towards sunset, where the sky turned a muted orange behind a veil of dust. The fading light cast long shadows across the ruins. Fires smoldered again as families prepared for another night. Some whispered prayers, others remained silent. A deep weariness hung in the air. It felt ancient and heavy. The survivors curled under blankets, their breaths shallow, their eyes vacant. Night arrived quietly. The land grew darker. The sickness continued its silent work. And through the stillness, the valley held the weight of a sorrow that seemed too large for any voice to describe. The sixth day rose with a dim pale light that barely touched the broken rooftops. The sky hung low over the ruins as if weighed down by the suffering beneath it. Survivors stirred from a night of restless dreams. Many woke with their bodies aching in ways they could not explain. Their joints felt stiff, their muscles weak. Some tried to stand but sank back to the ground as dizziness swept over them. The sickness had rooted itself deep and would not loosen its hold. Let us drift toward the old marketplace where people gathered to share what little food remained. Baskets held scraps of rice and dried fish. The food tasted dull and strange. One man lifted a handful of rice and noticed fine black dust mixed within it. He tried to pick it out but soon gave up. Hunger outweighed caution. He ate slowly. His throat felt dry. Minutes later, a wave of nausea passed through him. He covered his mouth and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the world seemed distant and blurred. Nearby, a woman knelt beside her teenage daughter, whose lips had turned a faint shade of blue. The girl breathed shallowly. Her heartbeat fluttered like a fading echo. The woman whispered soothing words, but her own hands trembled violently. She felt a burning heat under her skin. She brushed her hair back and watched strands fall onto the ground. Each loss carried a quiet terror. She wrapped a cloth around her daughter and held her close. She hoped warmth would help, but the girl's body felt cold despite the rising sun. Let us move toward a narrow alley where rescue workers rested on fallen beams. They had spent days searching the ruins for survivors. Now their bodies refused to continue. One worker coughed into his sleeve and stared at the red stains that appeared. He wiped them away with slow disbelief. Another worker leaned forward with his head in his hands. He said he felt an emptiness growing inside him, as if his strength was leaking away. They tried to stand again, but their legs buckled. They felt trapped between duty and the limits of their failing bodies. At the temple courtyard, the monk continued to offer prayers, but his voice had grown softer. His breath came short. He felt pain behind his eyes. He walked among the wounded and offered water, but each step felt heavier than the last. He paused at the sight of an old man who had collapsed during the night. The old man's face looked peaceful yet pale. The monk touched his wrist and felt no pulse. He bowed his head in silence. The courtyard held too many moments like this now. Let us drift toward an aid station where doctors worked with shaking hands. Their medical supplies had dwindled. Their energy had nearly vanished. One doctor lifted a young woman's arm to check her pulse. Her skin tore at the slightest touch. He felt a deep helplessness settle in his heart. Another doctor leaned against the wall for support as he examined a child. The child looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. The doctor wanted to reassure the child, but he could barely form the words. His throat felt raw. His vision dimmed. He steadied himself and continued working. Across the ruins, families attempted to create shade using blankets tied to broken beams. They gathered beneath the thin shelter and tried to rest. The air felt thick and still. A baby cried weakly. The sound drifted through the silent streets. A mother lifted the baby and rocked gently. She whispered that everything would be all right. Yet she felt her own heartbeat weaken. Her arms trembled. She wondered how long she could keep holding her child. Let us float over the river where the water shimmered under the morning light. Survivors approached the banks carefully. Some filled jars while others washed their faces. A man dipped his hands into the river. When he lifted them, he felt a tingling sensation along his fingers. He stared at his palms and saw faint white patches forming. He rubbed them together, but the patches did not fade. Another survivor washed his wounds in the water and felt a sudden sharp pain. He pulled his arm back in alarm. The wound had begun to bleed again. Farther along the river, 2 children searched for driftwood to bring back to their families. They moved slowly, their steps unsteady. One child bent to pick up a piece of wood, but fell forward onto his knees. He tried to rise, but his arms shook too much. The second child helped him stand, but the effort left both gasping for breath. They returned with only a few small sticks. Their eyes held the dullness of exhaustion. Let us move toward the center of the blast site, where soldiers continued their measurements. Their notebooks filled with sketches and circles and faint notes about heat and distance. One soldier stood still with his hand pressed to his chest. His heartbeat felt irregular. He breathed slowly, but the air seemed too light to support him. He leaned against a shattered wall and slid to the ground. His commander rushed to his side, but the commander himself struggled to kneel. Their strength was fading hour by hour. By midday, the sun shone through a haze of dust. The light felt too bright. The heat pressed down like a heavy blanket. People sought shade, but found little relief. A man lying beneath a broken beam closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he felt a tightness in his throat. He tried to swallow, but the sensation did not pass. He whispered for help, but his voice sounded faint. A nearby woman reached for him, but collapsed before she could take his hand. Let us drift toward the hillside where a group of survivors had gathered in hopes of cleaner air. They spread blankets on the ground and rested. A young boy pointed to the sky and asked when the birds would return. His mother told him they would come back soon, yet she felt unsure. The sky held strange stillness. Only a few distant shapes moved across it. The land felt empty in a way that unsettled even the youngest hearts. As the afternoon faded, many survivors developed fevers. Their bodies burned hot, sweat poured from their skin. Some fainted, others shook with chills. A doctor examined several patients and noticed their gums bleeding. He wiped one patient's mouth with cloth and saw streaks of red appear again within seconds. He whispered that the sickness was attacking them from inside. He did not understand how. He only understood the pattern of decline. Let us float toward a collapsed home where an elderly couple sat together. The man held his wife's hand, but her fingers felt cool. Her breath grew shallow. She whispered his name. He leaned closer. She told him she felt tired. Too tired to remain awake. He held her hand against his chest. She closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. The man felt her hand grow still. He did not cry. He simply held her as the evening light dimmed around them. The sun lowered behind the distant hills, transforming the sky into muted shades of orange and gray. Shadows stretched across the ruins. Fires were lit again. Families huddled close. The night air felt heavy. Many who attempted to sleep awoke with chills. Others did not awaken at all. The silence grew deeper. Night settled firmly over the land. The sickness felt like a dark, unseen tide slowly rising through every body and every breath. The ruins lay quiet beneath the fading stars. The survivors whispered softly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. The long, slow descent into the unseen aftermath continued without mercy or rest. The days after August 6th moved with a quiet that felt unreal. The city no longer sounded like a place where people lived, breathed, talked, and worked. It was a hollow space where footsteps drifted without direction. Survivors walked along broken streets with slow movements and distant eyes. Every step felt heavier than the last. Every breath carried an aftertaste of smoke and metal. They could not yet understand what had happened. They only knew that something vast and beyond human scale had torn their world apart. Let us drift through these early days when the ground still shimmered with heat. Men carried buckets of water without speaking. Women searched for children through piles of wood paper and dust. Many called out names that never received an answer. The fires had passed, but the city kept burning inside the hearts that still lived. People felt grateful for survival, yet guilty for it too. No one had the strength to speak these feelings aloud. They simply moved forward in silence. The wounded filled every remaining structure. Schools, temples, empty homes, even open fields. Doctors who survived worked with a calm sadness. They knew they did not have enough supplies. They knew they could not save everyone. They tried anyway. Their hands trembled. Their eyes lacked sleep. But they continued. They pressed cloth against burns. They lifted limbs damaged by falling beams. They whispered soft words to calm frightened children. These quiet gestures formed the fragile boundary between life and death. A strange sickness had begun to take hold. At first, people thought it was simple exhaustion. They had lost homes, families, neighbors, and the sense of a future. Fatigue made sense, but soon the signs grew darker. Noses bled for no reason. Purple spots bloomed under the skin like silent bruises. Fever rose in sudden waves. Some survivors who appeared uninjured collapsed in the middle of the street without warning. No one understood why. They had no name for this condition. Let us walk into a small room in a ruined school where two sisters rested on straw mats. Their names were Keiko and Hannah. Keiko, the older one, tried to smile even though she felt a deep ache in her bones. Hannah gently held her hand and whispered stories from before the blast. They spoke of playing by the river. They spoke of festivals filled with lanterns. They spoke of the future as if speaking it aloud could keep it alive. But Keiko felt herself grow weaker with each passing hour. Outside that room, a doctor leaned against a wall made of cracked plaster. He wiped sweat from his forehead, though the air around him had cooled. He looked at his notes, though there was no medicine for what he witnessed. The sickness seemed to come from inside the blood itself. He wrote observations without understanding them. Hair falling out in clumps, skin peeling, endless thirst. Sudden bleeding. He did not know this was caused by radiation. The word held no meaning in that moment. Only the suffering was clear. Let us move to another corner of the city where an old man named Satoru searched through rubble. Each step raised small clouds of ash that settled back onto his clothes. He looked for a small wooden box that held a family photograph. This photograph was the last connection to the life he had lived before the Great Flash. He believed that if he found it, he would one day rebuild something of what he lost. The search stretched on for hours. When he finally found the box half burned, half broken, he held it close to his chest and let out a long, gentle sigh. Night arrived with a different kind of quiet. People gathered in small circles to share what little food they had. They boiled leaves. They shared rice if any survived. They lit lanterns though the light trembled in the wind. Some prayed. Some stared into the distance. Some simply sat in silence. The air carried a faint glow from fires still smoldering between collapsed houses. Survivors spoke softly so as not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled. In those hours, many felt a strange sensation in the air. It was neither hope nor despair. It was something between the two. A feeling that life insisted on continuing despite everything. Even though bodies weakened and hearts felt heavy, people helped each other. They carried water for strangers. They shared blankets. They guided the weak to safer ground. These simple acts formed a thin thread that kept the spirit of the city alive. Let us drift into the following morning when a small group of children wandered near the riverbank. They looked for toys that might have survived. A single doll floated in the shallow water, its face darkened by soot. One child reached for it and held it gently. They did not play with it. They just held it as a reminder of something they could not express. A reminder that they had once been children in a world that felt simple. The sickness continued to spread. People who walked strong 2 days earlier now found themselves unable to rise from their beds. Doctors whispered fears to each other. They noticed patterns. Families who had been closer to the blast grew weaker faster. Those who had been farther away seemed safer, though not entirely. But without knowledge, without tools, without teaching, they could only guess at causes. The sickness was invisible. And that made it terrifying. Across the ruined streets, survivors noticed another unsettling sign. Birds no longer filled the sky. Dogs no longer barked. The city felt too still. Nature itself seemed wounded by the blast. Trees stood stripped of leaves. Grass turned gray. The river carried debris along its surface. Everything looked altered. Everything felt distant. Still, people continued to care for each other. A woman named Aiko spent her days walking from shelter to shelter, offering warm tea from a single pot she kept safe. She did not have much, but she gave what she had. Survivors looked at her with grateful eyes. Her quiet kindness gave strength to those who felt too weak to hope. As days moved forward, the invisible sickness grew stronger. The people of Hiroshima now faced something they could not understand and could not escape. Their bodies fought a silent battle without weapons and without knowledge. And yet, even in this dark time, they still held hands, sang soft songs, shared stories, and dreamed of a day when light would return to their city. The story now moves deeper into this silent struggle. Lives hung in delicate balance between pain and courage, between fear and the quiet strength to continue. And so the journey of Hiroshima carried on, one step at a time, one breath at a time. The days that followed moved like a long, slow tide. Survivors felt as if time itself had softened. Nothing rushed. Nothing unfolded quickly. Every moment stretched into the next. The city remained silent except for the distant crack of collapsing walls or the soft footsteps of people searching for something they could not name. Hiroshima no longer looked like a place built by human hands. It looked like a landscape shaped by a single impossible moment. Let us drift into this quiet where the pain of the survivors deepened, yet the determination to live also grew stronger. People still gathered water from wells that had not cracked. They boiled it carefully over small fires. They washed wounds with gentle motions. They whispered calming words, though many had no voice left to offer. They shared warmth through blankets and shared hope through presence. Even in a world without certainty, these small acts kept the spirit of the city breathing. A new pattern began to emerge. The sickness that had puzzled the doctors now became unavoidable. It crept through shelters like a silent wind. People who looked healthy one morning grew weak by the evening. Their legs trembled, their vision blurred, their hair thinned. Purple marks appeared beneath their skin. Many tried to hide these signs, fearing they would worry their families. But the truth revealed itself with or without words. Let us step inside one of the makeshift hospitals in a half-ruined temple. Tatami mats lined the floor. Survivors rested side by side. A soft murmur filled the space as people whispered to each other or prayed under their breath. The doctor, who had observed the symptoms earlier, stood at the entrance with a distant stare. He understood that the sickness had no cure. He understood that many would not survive. Yet he continued to offer water to the weak and reassurance to the frightened. He believed that compassion still mattered even when medicine could not help. Among the wounded lay a boy named Ren. His mother sat beside him, brushing his hair gently. She told him stories of summer festivals. She described fireworks that once lit the night sky. She described sweet cold treats sold near the river. Ren listened with tired eyes. He wanted to believe he would see those things again. He wanted to believe that the world still held such beauty. His mother smiled for him, though tears gathered in her eyes. She whispered that he would grow strong again. She whispered that their future still waited for them. Outside, the temple workers lifted beams and cleared debris in slow, determined motions. They hoped to create safer paths for the survivors. They hoped to move bodies to respectful resting places. They hoped to restore some order to the city, though the scale of destruction made the task seem endless. The ground still held a strange warmth, and the air held the faint metallic scent that had lingered since the blast. No one understood why the environment felt so restless. They only knew they must continue. Let us move to the western edge of the city, where a small group of students gathered around a single candle. They were teenagers who had survived only by chance. Their school had collapsed, but they had been outside during the blast. They spoke softly about classmates they had not seen since that day. They promised each other that once the city healed, they would rebuild their lives together. Their voices trembled with uncertainty, though they tried to sound brave. Night returned with its heavy silence. Stars appeared faint above the city as if dimmed by the lingering dust. Survivors lay awake listening to distant cries or quiet whispers. Some felt waves of fever, others felt shivers. A few felt nothing at all as exhaustion swallowed them. But there were moments of tenderness as well. A child reached for a parent. A neighbor offered warm rice. A stranger shared a piece of cloth to use as a pillow. These small gestures kept hope alive like faint embers glowing in the darkness. The sickness grew worse. Doctors noted that even people who had been far from the blast began to show signs. Bleeding from gums. Sudden weakness. Sores that refused to heal. They kept detailed notes, though they did not know if anyone would ever read them. They felt it was important to record what they witnessed. History needed truth, even when truth was painful. They believed that someday people might understand what had happened here. Let us visit a quiet corner where an elderly woman named Tommy knelt beside the remains of her home. She held a single ceramic bowl that had survived the explosion. It had belonged to her grandmother. She ran her fingers along its rim with slow, gentle movements. She whispered a soft prayer to those she had lost. She whispered a promise that she would continue living for their sake. Even though her heart felt heavy, she stood up and walked toward the shelters, carrying the bowl close to her chest. Morning brought pale light that revealed new suffering. People who had grown weaker now struggled to rise. Many lost their appetite, some could no longer speak. The doctors moved from one patient to another with tired, steady steps. They offered what little comfort they could. They refused to look away from the reality before them. They believed that facing suffering directly was an act of respect. Yet even in these harsh days, something remarkable continued. People kept helping each other. A man gave his last portion of rice to a neighbor he barely knew. A young woman carried water for 3 shelters, even though her own legs shook with fatigue. A child offered half of her sweet potato to an elderly couple. These acts formed threads that connected the survivors. They felt stronger when they stood together. Let us drift toward the river, where bodies still drifted in slow motion. Volunteers formed a line along the bank to gather them. They handled each body with tender care. They placed cloth over the faces. They whispered words of peace. They believed that the dead deserved respect, no matter how tragic their passing had been. This quiet duty grounded them. It reminded them that even in devastation, humanity must continue with dignity. As the sun set again, Hiroshima grew quiet. Fires had dimmed, dust had settled, but the sickness grew deeper in the bodies of those who survived. Yet they still held on to each other. They still believed that the light of life could persist in a city touched by destruction beyond imagination. Their strength came not from certainty but from the simple decision to rise each morning and endure. The journey continues. The days ahead will reveal more of the silent battle within the survivors. And yet we continue to walk with them step by step, breath by breath, as Hiroshima searches for a way forward. The next morning arrived with a faint gray light that settled over the ruins like a thin veil. It did not warm the city. It did not brighten it. It simply drifted down as if unsure whether Hiroshima was still a place meant for daylight. Survivors rose slowly from the floors of shelters, rubbing their arms and legs to encourage warmth back into their bodies. Many felt a deep tiredness that seemed to settle into their bones. It was the kind of fatigue that no sleep could fix. The sickness now lived inside them like a quiet shadow. Let us drift into the central district where broken steel beams still leaned at strange angles against shattered walls. A group of volunteers stepped carefully through the debris. Their goal was simple though, heavy. They searched for anyone who might still need help. Most of the time, they found only stillness. But sometimes they heard a faint breath or a weak call for water. When they found someone alive, they held that person with gentle hands. They lifted them onto stretchers made from torn futons. They whispered that they were safe now, though safety was still an uncertain word. A man named Jun worked tirelessly among these volunteers. He had lost his wife in the blast, yet he returned each morning to the ruins. He believed that helping others was the only way to keep his own heart steady. One morning, he found a young girl lying beside a collapsed doorway. Her hair had fallen out in patches. Her eyes looked unfocused. She whispered that she was cold. Jun wrapped her in his own jacket, though he shivered in the cool air. He lifted her carefully and carried her toward the shelters. With each step, his legs trembled, yet he did not stop. He felt that every small act mattered. Inside one of the larger shelters, doctors fought a quiet battle against time. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and smoke. Patients lay in long rows, breathing in slow, uneven rhythms. Many had fevers that rose and fell in waves. Some had sores that oozed despite daily cleaning. Others had bleeding gums and fragile skin that bruised at the slightest touch. The doctors spoke in soft tones so they would not disturb those resting. They changed bandages and offered sips of water. They did not pretend that they could save everyone. But they believed that easing suffering was still a meaningful duty. Let us step toward a corner where a teacher named Keiko sat with two of her surviving students. They huddled together under a single blanket. Keiko had once taught lessons filled with bright colors and cheerful stories. Now she spoke in steady whispers about resilience. She told her students that life sometimes brought storms that could not be predicted. She said that even when everything felt broken, they could still hold on to kindness. The students listened with tired eyes. They leaned against her shoulder, seeking comfort in her steady presence. The nights grew colder. Survivors gathered around small fires made from broken furniture. Sparks drifted through the air like wandering fireflies. People told quiet stories about their lives before the blast. They spoke of summer festivals and river picnics and laughter shared with friends. They did not speak loudly. They did not cry loudly. Everything in these days felt muted, as if the world itself asked for silence. Yet the sharing of memories created warmth that no fire could match. A soldier tasked with maintaining order walked through the shelters each night, offering gentle instructions. He asked people to keep the fires small. He asked them to conserve water. He asked them to rest whenever possible. He did not carry the strictness of a commander. Instead, he moved with quiet patience. He understood that the survivors already bore more weight than anyone should. Each night before leaving, he bowed slightly and said he would return at dawn. Let us move to the riverbank, where volunteers continued their solemn work. The river flowed with a soft, steady rhythm, carrying small fragments of wood and cloth. The volunteers lifted bodies from the water with deliberate care. They placed each one on a wooden platform and covered them with cloth. A priest walked beside them, offering prayers that blended with the sound of flowing water. This ritual gave structure to days that otherwise felt shapeless. It reminded the living that respect endured even in devastation. Small signs of change appeared. A few shops at the edge of the city reopened with minimal supplies. People lined up for rice and tea. The smell of warm broth filled the air, bringing a faint sense of normal life. A mother carrying her child paused to inhale the scent deeply. It reminded her of mornings before the blast. She felt tears sting her eyes, yet she smiled for her child. She wanted the little one to believe that life could still taste good. The sickness, however, continued its silent spread. Some survivors woke with new symptoms they had not felt before. Dizziness that made the world tilt, bleeding from their noses. Sudden weakness that forced them to sit down. Doctors recognized that the sickness was not random. It followed patterns, though they did not yet understand the cause. They wrote careful notes on scraps of paper. They hoped someone someday would study these details and learn something useful. Let us visit the Eastern District, where a grandmother named Fumiko tended a small fire outside her home. The house had lost its roof and half its walls. Yet she swept the ground each morning and arranged stones around the fire with precise, gentle motions. She believed that these small routines protected her spirit. Children from nearby shelters often gathered around her because she told soft bedtime stories about old myths. She spoke of mountains that guarded the land and rivers that carried ancient secrets. The children listened with wide eyes. Her voice soothed them in a world that no longer felt safe. One evening, a faint rain began to fall. Survivors stepped outside their shelters and lifted their hands toward the sky. The drops were warm at first, then cooler. People hoped the rain would wash away the dust that coated their skin. But the rain carried a strange texture. It felt heavy. Some drops left faint marks on clothes and skin. Doctors warned people not to stay outside for long. They feared the rain carried something harmful, though they could not explain what. Inside the shelters, the sound of rain brought a gentle rhythm that lulled some to sleep. Others lay awake, listening to the soft patter on broken roofs. They thought about the future. They wondered when they might rebuild their homes. They wondered when their bodies would stop aching. They wondered how long the sickness would last. These thoughts drifted through their minds like slow-moving clouds. Let us float to a quiet room where a young man named Haruto wrote in a small journal. His hands shook, yet he continued to write. He believed it was important to record what he saw each day. He wrote about the pain and the strength. He wrote about the quiet heroism shown by people who had lost everything. He wrote in hopes that future generations would understand the cost of destruction. He believed that truth must be preserved even when it hurt. Days passed. The city remained wounded, yet the hearts of its people refused to surrender. They woke each morning despite their weakness. They shared food even when they had little. They helped strangers as though they were family. The sickness still spread. The grief still lingered. But so did kindness. So did determination. So did the quiet belief that rising again mattered. Hiroshima continued its slow journey toward healing. The road ahead was long and filled with uncertainty. Yet the survivors walked it together, one slow step at a time, as the shadows of the past followed gently behind them. Night faded into a pale, dull light as the third day began. The valley stirred with slow, tired movements, as if the entire landscape had aged 100 years in a single sunrise. People rose from the ground with heavy limbs. Many felt weaker than the day before. Their steps dragged across the broken earth. Their eyes burned with a strange sting that water could not soothe. The air carried a faint, bitter taste that lingered on the tongue no matter how much someone tried to wash it away. It felt as if the air itself had been wounded. Let us drift toward the river where the banks had grown darker. The soil turned soft under the feet of the survivors. They did not know why the earth seemed to hold the warmth of the blast even after days had passed. Some scooped water for drinking, though the surface shimmered with a thin, oily film. People told themselves it was only ash. They had to believe it was safe. Thirst overshadowed fear. A child drank deeply, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Moments later, he felt a strange heat spread through his chest. He sat down and held his stomach. His mother looked at him with tired eyes. She wanted to comfort him, but she could barely stand. Across the valley, rescue workers continued to gather bodies. The workers moved slowly. Their legs trembled under their own weight. They had arrived only a day earlier, yet the same strange weakness had touched them as well. One worker lifted a body and saw that strands of hair clung to his gloves. The slightest pressure caused the hair to slip free. He stared in disbelief. He felt a shiver race through him, though the morning air was warm. He wiped his face with his sleeve and noticed small red marks forming along his wrist. Let us float toward the remains of the school building where a group of survivors gathered. The walls leaned in strange angles. The roof had collapsed. Only part of the entrance arch remained. A teacher who survived led several children out into the open to give them fresh air. The children walked slowly. Some clutched their stomachs. Others held their heads. A boy began to bleed from his nose without warning. The teacher tried to stop the blood with cloth torn from his shirt. The cloth darkened quickly. The teacher felt fear rising in his chest, but he forced his voice to remain calm for the children's sake. Near the marketplace, soldiers cleared debris from the roads. They used long poles to shift the remains of wooden carts and collapsed beams. One soldier grabbed a broken gate and stepped back with surprise. The wood felt unusually warm. He placed his hand near it again and felt heat radiating from within, as if the material still remembered the blast. He looked at his partner, who shrugged with tired confusion. They continued their work. They did not understand why their fingers tingled after touching ordinary objects. Let us move toward a small house at the edge of the blast zone. Its roof was gone, but its walls still stood. Inside, an elderly woman sat with her back against a beam. She breathed slowly. Her skin had turned a pale, waxy color. A doctor kneeled beside her. He tried to give her water, but she shook her head. She whispered that she felt cold, even though her forehead burned with fever. The doctor touched her arm gently. Her skin peeled away under his fingertips. He pulled his hand back in horror, but forced himself to stay beside her. Her breathing slowed with each passing moment until it finally stopped. Outside the house, a group of men gathered around a small fire. They whispered softly. They spoke of strange dreams and restless nights. They spoke of a sensation that felt like insects crawling beneath their skin. One man scratched his arm until it bled. Another man said he felt as if something heavy sat on his chest. None of them knew the word for what was happening. They only felt that something unseen was moving through their bodies. Let us drift toward the temple courtyard, where more survivors had gathered. The monk who rang the cracked bell continued to offer prayers. His voice trembled slightly. He did not understand the sickness any more than the others. He only knew that people who looked fine in the morning could weaken by evening. A woman approached him holding her son. The child's eyes were swollen. His breath came in shallow gasps. The woman knelt and asked for help. The monk placed a hand on the boy's forehead. The heat pulsed through the skin like a burning coal. The monk whispered a prayer, though he felt a quiet helplessness settle in his chest. At the temporary aid station, doctors tried to record symptoms. They took notes in small journals, now covered with ash. They described vomiting, lethargy, gum bleeding, hair loss, skin shedding without touch. The doctors looked at one another with confusion. Diseases they knew did not behave this way. Injuries they understood did not appear without wounds. Something invisible was attacking the survivors from within. They did not understand its nature. They only understood its effect. Let us float toward a stretch of flattened ground near the heart of the blast site. Soldiers marked the area with small wooden stakes. They measured distances from the center. They sketched circles in their notebooks. One officer stood silently staring at the charred earth. He whispered that the force must have been like the sun brought down to the surface. He wondered aloud how anyone survived at all. His voice trembled. He wiped his brow. His hand came away with strands of hair. He stared at it with growing fear. As the sun reached its peak, the temperature rose. The heat pressed down on the valley. People moved toward the few remaining patches of shade. They carried blankets, water jars, bundles of burnt belongings. Some lay on the ground and closed their eyes, hoping to sleep through the pain. Others sat upright, staring into the distance with empty expressions. Their minds drifted. Their bodies weakened. Time moved slowly. Each minute stretched into an hour. By late afternoon, the first signs of deep exhaustion began to spread across the survivors. A young man who had been helping carry water suddenly collapsed. His friends rushed to him. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. His lips turned pale. His eyes rolled upward. They tried to lift him, but he felt heavier than before. They called for a doctor. But the doctor who arrived looked nearly as weak as the patient. The doctor examined the young man, then lowered his head. He said the same phrase he had repeated all day. There was nothing he could do. Let us glide toward the horizon, where faint lines of smoke still rose. The sky held a dusty gray tone that dimmed the sunlight. The world looked washed out, flat, silent. Even the birds seemed reluctant to return to the valley. The few that circled above drifted away quickly, as if sensing danger that humans could not. Evening approached slowly. The survivors prepared for another night. Fires were lit using scraps of wood. People wrapped themselves in blankets, though the air remained warm. They whispered to one another. They asked why their families were falling ill. They asked when help would arrive. They asked why the world felt different now. The answers did not come. As darkness settled over the ruined land, an uneasy quiet filled the valley. The sound of wind carried through broken beams and shattered walls. The fires flickered. Shadows stretched across the ground. The survivors lay down again hoping for rest, though sleep came rarely. The night grew colder. The sickness grew stronger. And the unseen force continued its silent, steady reach through every body it touched. This was only the beginning of the long, slow aftermath that would unfold through the days ahead.